Hi, welcome to our study on Paul's letter to the churches in Galatians. Today we're going to look at Galatians chapter 5. But before we do that, we need to re-pick up and remember what happened in chapter 4, where Paul makes an analogy using the story of Abram and Sarah. And to understand that, we kind of need to look at a cultural piece a little bit. And what that is when you go back in history, we have different understandings of how the human body worked and different things work. So when you go back to the time period of Abram and Sarah, there's a very basic understanding, and it makes sense because it's an understanding based on what you could observe with your eyes. And the understanding was of how children were made, where they came from. And the belief was pretty simple, and this is why you'll see in the Old Testament laws governing semen and laws governing blood and the way they are will make sense of this. At the base level, what the understanding was is a man put semen in a woman. God shaped and formed that into a child. The woman had nothing to do with making children. They were an incubator for God's work and then gave birth to that child that God formed in them using the stuff that came from the male. And that is how children were made. And then the woman helped to raise and feed and raise them, but did not contribute to the making of the children. So one of the cultural pieces that plays in this with the story of Abram and Sarah that I talked about with the last section is that they received a promise from God that they were going to have a child, a male son, even though Sarah was past the age of having children. After a while, when time had passed and she still hadn't had a child, they followed this custom knowing and thinking in this way as to how children are made. And so Sarah offered up her servant, her slave, Hagar, and her and Abram laid together, and she was with child and gave birth to a son, which would be his because of that understanding that God took the stuff of the man and sculpted into a child in the woman. And so it would be his and Sarah's because that child came from him. And they were helping God by following these cultural laws to fulfill the promise of God. Then God finally gives her her own child in her own womb. And after they have that child, then Abram realizes he needs to send away Hagar and her son and does so. And how Paul uses that story is that son from Hagar was birthed out of the use of the law, ignoring the promise of God and not fully trusting in God, trusting in themselves and their own abilities by using the law and using it correctly, instead of waiting, trusting in God, which eventually happened by the child born to Sarah by the promise. And so the child born of law gets sent away, and the child by promise is kept, and they stay focused on God and God's promise. And Paul uses that to show us the danger of the law, and that the law was not there showing us God's will. The law was not there showing us what God wanted, but the law was there to discipline us, to limit our sin, and that we who get what Jesus has done for us by faith in Jesus are someone of the promise instead of the law. So he continues with 5:1 with this incredible, profound sentence, and it really makes sense in light of understanding how he's using the Abram and Sarah story with Hagar in there. He says this in 5:1, "For freedom Christ has set us free." We were not free before Christ. We were slaves to sin. We were slaves to the law. Sin's greatest tool was the law. And we are set free from it by what Jesus did on the cross for us. In his death and resurrection, he has, by our faith in that, he has set us free. And he set us free so that we could live a different life than what we are trying to do, to try and impress God through our faithfulness to the law, through our actions, through trying to be good enough, through trying to show that, I volunteered for this, I volunteered for that, doing all of these things to try and impress God or obligate God to us, that we are set free from all of that by our faith in Jesus so that we can live very differently. And Paul will get into it, what that is and what that looks like. But let us continue. So he continues, "Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." Do not submit to the law. Do not let the law be that which dictates and controls your life. Paul is wanting us to think and function very different as followers of Jesus. 5:2. Listen, I, Paul, am telling you that if you let yourself be circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. Here's that opposition again. Circumcision, the law, the flesh are on one side. Faith in Jesus, justification before God, come through Christ, come through the cross, not through the law. And they're put as a contrast. If you become circumcised, you are taking the law back on, and now you have to prove to God your faithfulness through a complete obedience to that law. You have thrown out Jesus, and you have thrown out Christ and what he's about. Paul continues in verse 3. Once again, I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obliged to obey the entire law. So if you pick one, you pick them all. Or to put it in other words, within the context of the arguments Paul's been making, Jesus was the one who came and 100% fully fulfilled the law and the way God intended. That means if you take on any part of the law to stand before God, then you need to live your life so that it exactly mirrors the way in which Jesus lived his. In other words, you need to be Jesus yourself. So you either do it or you're going to fail. If you fail at any piece of it, you fail at all of it, because the only way to not fail is to have a life that looks 100% like Jesus' life in everything you do, say, and think. This is the tension Paul is showing. The law was given as a disciplinarian until Christ would come to remove the law and put us focused on God by the Spirit in us. And he'll say more about this. You who want to be justified by the law have cut yourself off from Christ. You cannot put the two together. You have cut yourself off from Christ if you're going to focus on the law. You have fallen away from grace. So not only if you choose the law, choose circumcision, grace is no longer, that undeserved gift from God is removed from the equation altogether. You have completely cut yourself off from Christ. You have cut yourself off from grace. With that, you've cut yourself off from mercy, even though here Paul does not say that directly. It's part of understanding what grace is and how grace is functioning. Through the Spirit, by faith, we eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. So righteousness, in Paul's eyes, in this part of the letter, is not something we earn. It's the Spirit working through us by our faith that we have hope, and that righteousness comes to us. So that when God sees us, God sees we are righteous, not because we have earned this righteousness, other than trusting in Jesus, and it's gifted to us. That's the profoundness of what Paul is saying here. He continues in verse 6. For in Jesus Christ, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. So when we get what Jesus has done for us on that cross, when we fully get what is happening, we are set free from the law. We are set free from sin. We are made new. And what that newness is it frees us to begin to fully love everybody God brings across our path, to fully learn to love and embrace more and more as we realize we are loved by God and they are loved by God, and we want them to know they are loved by God, and we want to see them set free from their own bondage to sin, their own need to try and impress everyone around them, impress themselves, all of those struggles, to be set free and know they are loved, and to simply live in a place of loving each other as fully as possible. 5:7, you were running well. Who prevented you from obeying the truth? You knew the truth in Jesus, is what Paul's saying. You knew it. I shared it with you. And now you've thrown it out. Such persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. God is the one who calls us. God would not call you in this way, where you now got to jump through a whole other set of hoops to make God happy. For Paul, it's a complete contradiction. A little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough. Verse 10, I am confident about you in the Lord that you will not think otherwise, but whoever it is that is confusing you will pay the penalty. But my friends, why am I still being persecuted if I'm still preaching circumcision? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would castrate themselves. In other words, look, if I, Paul, were sitting here preaching, you need to be circumcised, the Jewish community would not be after me. They are after me because I am preaching the cross of Christ, which says faith in Jesus and what he did on that cross sets us free, not our obedience to circumcision and all of the laws that we have. It's that faith in Jesus. That's why I'm being persecuted, because it contradicts their understanding of things. That's why these Jewish Christians are coming in and trying to change things, because what they really want is the law, God's law, and are afraid of the grace of God, that undeserved gift. Let us continue in verse 13. You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. In other words, when we get what Jesus has done for us, he has set us free. We are not free until then. What we do is we sin. We make everything about ourselves and then try and convince ourselves that it's not about us, that we're really doing it for others, when deep down inside, we know it is about us. We are set free in Christ, and in that being set free, what Paul then says is what that looks like is when you get you're fully loved and understand that everybody else is loved by God, you want to make yourself a slave to one another out of love. Your goal is to set everything about you aside to love people in every way you possibly can. And that is the heart of his understanding of the gospel. That is how getting what Christ has done for you changes you and moves you and shifts how you think. Let us continue with 14. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. In other words, if we had gotten what the law was truly about, we would be living, love your neighbor as yourself. If we had gotten it, we would have lived it. That's what Jesus came and lived. Love your neighbor as yourself, which is incredibly hard to do when you start thinking about it, to really let go of yourself, because how much of our time, how much of our energy is about us protecting ourselves, making ourselves feel safe, giving ourselves comforts. We spend a lot of time and energy focused on self and act as if we don't, but we really spend a lot of our time and energy focused on ourselves. If we really let go, we would think about how we live differently. We probably wouldn't all be chasing our own private little homes. We might live very differently if the full goal was how do we truly live in love, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus fulfilled this. That's why the cross is so paramount and so important. Let us continue. 5:16. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. So spirit in contrast with flesh. Flesh, law, sin, all on one side. Spirit, grace, faith, love. Live by the Spirit. Verse 17, for what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For those are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. Let me play with this just a little bit. The Spirit is pointing us toward God, God's love for us, and our freedom through that love, through Christ. And what the flesh is doing is it's turning us in on ourselves. We use people to make ourselves feel good. We use people to make ourselves feel more important or more powerful. We put ourselves over everything else. We focus on us instead of God. The Spirit drives us to focus on God and others. The flesh drives us to focus on ourselves. But we're good at focusing on ourselves and creating a narrative that makes us think we're focused on others and focused on God. That's the whole challenge, but that's why they're opposed to each other. Paul continues. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. Let me say that again. But if you are led by the Spirit, focused on God, this is huge, you are not subject to the law. That's a challenge. Most of Christianity tries to figure out a way to bring the law back in and re-enslave us to the law, but acting as if we have the law correct now. I remember many occasions where I had someone say to me, or try to bring the law back in as if, but what God does is gives us the power through Jesus to fulfill the law. No, the law is in opposition to Christ. There's no third way. There's no go-between. We focus on Christ, and we will act differently, and that becomes centered in love. So hear how he continues with this. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissension, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. I want to play with this just a little bit, because one of the struggles is when I go and look at commentaries on this, they want to map out a bunch of the definitions of these words, and they do it from a perspective of understanding, especially the ones where they want to look at sexual impurity. They always do it from a modern perspective, from current times, that thinks of marriage in a very simple way. And one commentary I looked at said biblical marriage. And right away, that raised a red flag for me. Not because I have an issue with biblical marriage. It's just I understand that there's a whole bunch of models of biblical marriage, and realized that that author wasn't thinking in, I don't think was thinking in terms of all of those. So let me give you an example. One model of a biblical marriage is that if I go to war and I conquer a village and kill the husband, I can take the wife as my new wife or as a slave. I can take the daughter as a wife or a slave, and that's a legitimate biblical marriage. If I were to rape my neighbor's daughter and then turn around and give the dowry for her, she would then become legally my biblical wife and would need to sexually submit to me. There's multiple models of marriage in the Bible, so when someone says biblical marriage, what does it mean? I don't think Paul's getting at things this way, because he's just said we're set free from the law. He's put the law in opposition to faith. So let me try and flesh this out in a way that I think is more helpful. What Paul is getting at is the things that are focused on us. If I use sex to make myself feel good, and I'm not using sex as a shared thing, now I'm sinning. If I use people and relationships for myself, the focus is me. That's why he uses terms like idolatry. When I start using the people and things in my life to build up my own self-esteem, to make me feel good, to distract me from things I don't want to deal with, I don't want to face with, that is living by the flesh. That is what I think Paul is trying to get at. I sit there and make factions, or I get angry and try and control people with my anger, or try to intentionally be divisive and break things apart. That's about me, my power over, which is all putting the focus on me and not God. That is the work of the flesh. So don't get bogged down on trying to say, oh, fornication, very specific. It's way bigger than this that Paul's getting at. What the flesh is about is me trying to make the world revolve around me, and me using people and things and resources and everything for myself over for God and others. And that's more of what he's getting at. That then makes sense of how he continues in 5:22. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. So let me get at the fruit in a simple way. It is not things we intentionally strive after, because again, what has Paul said in this? That the Spirit, Jesus gives us the Spirit when we realize by faith what Jesus has done for us. His gift to us is not a new set of laws. It's not the go juice to get the law right. He gives us the Spirit. When the Spirit is allowed to reign in our life, these are the attributes, the traits that come out of us. So a sign of someone growing in faith is they become more loving, more joy-filled, more peaceful, more patient. Kindness grows, generosity grows, faithfulness grows, gentleness grows, self-control grows. All of these things happen not because I'm intentionally trying to make them happen, but because I am focusing on the Spirit of God. I am letting the Spirit reign in my life. I am focused on what God has done for me through Jesus on that cross. These things come out and counter the things of the flesh. And so the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit is not a striving thing. It's a thing that blossoms in me when I learn to trust God more and more and let the Spirit guide me. And Paul wants us to let those things guide us. When we realize this and we see an opportunity to love, take the risk and love even more fully. That would be the Spirit already working in you. That's what Paul means by letting the Spirit guide you. And as that Spirit guides you, and as you truly focus on Christ, you won't become conceited, competing against one another, or envying one another. Those things will be let go of because it's about God's love for you, and you becoming a slave of love to others because of what God has done for you. Well, thanks for spending a little bit of time with me. We have one more chapter, and we will get to that shortly. God's blessings to all of you. Thanks.